I can't leave you. But you're constantly leaving me.
It's too fucking exhausting loving you.
That's not love.
I can see
There are plenty of other girls out there in the world, Jess. You could go out and at least find one that you actually care about.
Lucas asked me to marry him.
The girls that I like don't give a damn about me.
And it took you
Everything we went through, and one day he's just gone.
Back us up and leave me with it.
I made a mistake.
Holding all this love
I don't
out
care.
in the hall.
Just leave.
I
Though you
think
didn't
I've
want to
seen
lose
this
it.
film
You will.
He already has.
at the ending. You're
Fuck
not
her.
my
Shut the fuck
landing.
You do not get to talk shit on her like that, okay?
Who am I defending now? You were my town. Now I'm in exile, seeing you out. I think I've
I seem
seen
to have a habit
this
of
film
losing people
before.
closest to me.
I just don't want to lose you.
I'm not yours to lose. It's too late. I can see you stare around, honey.
It's too late.
Like he's
She's
just
happy with someone else.
Yes. You think that
You don't deserve something, so you ruin it.
Second, third, and
I've given you so many chances. She has moved on and she is very happy.
He doesn't deserve you. He's not good enough for you.
Who does deserve me?
I think I've seen this.
I swore I would never let you string me along again.
Stay the fuck out of my head.
It's my nightmare.
Por supuesto.
Not yours.
Allison.
I loved you. And you left me.
And you come back acting as if nothing's changed. But I did.
So I'm leaving out the side door.
You want out?
Get out.
Step right out.
You fucking left me
Quédate conmigo, Lidia. Te necesito.
when I fucking needed you.
The thing that I needed was you.
How could you lie to me? How could you?
I didn't mean for this to happen.
You never gave no warning sign. All this time.
I know you.
I know you like I know my own name. I thought you did.
I was always you, Jimmy. Esto no me que tocas.
I destroyed everything.
You're the one that destroys people.
People who love each other,
I love you. And you love me.
it just
Look what that love has brought.
doesn't always work out.
But I know that you'll hurt me.
I never meant to hurt
Again and again.
But you did. Oh, excuse me if I don't fall for that. Or you ever again.
I can't just sit here while I'm waiting for you to come back.
No, here I am. Waiting for you to show up.
But I'm done running after you. You can hate me for leaving. You were running away. And I did it for you.
Don't say you're doing this for me.
I did it for you because you're afraid.
I was afraid.
Emily,
And when I'm afraid, I run away.
don't fight for love. Terrified of it.
I expected you to fight for me.
How was I supposed to know?
Just are.
It's probably too late. I just needed to tell you. It's never Beth I loved.
Damn you. We're done. This is why are you saying this? Why now?
Now, I thought you knew. I love you too, Jared. But
That's not a reason to stay.
The truth is, you always felt like you were compromising yourself to be with me. And you're right, that's not love.